The billionaire's twin daughters were deaf, but everything changed when the new maid arrived. Jonathan Harris, a billionaire still scarred by the pain of loss, believed his twin daughters would never hear a single sound. Years of repeated diagnosis and failed treatments seemed to confirm absolute silence. But everything changed with the arrival of Grace, the new maid, who brought not only care, but also a different perspective, one that allowed her to notice signs in the girls that no one else had ever seen. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Jonathan Harris walked slowly down the main hallway of the mansion, a vast space with light-colored walls and tall windows that let in the morning sun. To the outside world, he was a man who had everything a successful businessman, the head of one of the country's largest tech companies, a leader admired for his vision and innovation. But within those immense walls, he carried a burden no title or fortune could ease. A widower since the birth of his daughters, he was raising his twin girls, Emily and Sophie, now 7 years old, who had been diagnosed as profoundly deaf when they were still babies. The silence that enveloped their lives was not something he ever grew used to. It was a constant absence that hurt him every single day. The home that should have echoed with laughter, music, and conversations was instead marked by an unbreakable void. Jonathan watched his daughters grow, and though he cherished every detail of their personalities, he felt powerless to give them the one thing he wished for most: the right to hear the world. The mansion, a symbol of prosperity, had also become a portrait of a father's frustrated struggle. Each of the girls' bedrooms was filled with state-of-the-art equipment, hearing devices purchased from different countries, toys designed to stimulate responses, and stacks of technical reports. There were shelves of picture books used during therapy, boxes of musical instruments that sat untouched, and neatly arranged tables where speech therapists had left notes from their weekly sessions. Despite all of it, the routine never changed. Emily and Sophie kept playing in silence, exchanging knowing glances and smiling at each other, but never reacting to a voice or sound. Jonathan followed each activity proposed by the professionals he hired, maintaining strict discipline so he wouldn't fail in any exercise. Yet every night ended the same way. Nothing changed. The silence felt immovable, as if it were part of the very foundation of the house. The first doctor Jonathan had consulted was Dr. Collins, a well-regarded specialist whose reputation inspired confidence. After a round of initial tests, Collins declared the girls profoundly and irreversibly deaf. Jonathan never forgot that cold examination room, the graphs displayed on the screen, and the doctor's firm words that seemed to seal his daughter's fate. Shaken but unwilling to give up, he sought a second opinion. He then met Dr. Wallace, another authority in the field, who repeated the same diagnosis without hesitation, reinforcing Collins's verdict and leaving no room for doubt. Still unwilling to accept it, Jonathan took the twins to Dr. Monroe, equally respected, who reviewed the earlier results and reached the same conclusion: total deafness with no hope of reversal. She recommended expensive treatments that combined visual stimulation with advanced auditory devices, insisting that at the very least, they might bring some comfort. Jonathan, lacking the knowledge to argue, trusted her judgment. Time went by, and so did the expenses. With every new report, Jonathan read the same technical notes, each one confirming the absence of auditory response and advising him to keep the therapy routine unchanged. He accepted every word as absolute truth, convinced he was doing the best for his daughters. It was common to see therapists moving through the house, arranging toys, adjusting equipment, and repeating activities that felt mechanical. Emily tended to be more engaged during these sessions, leafing through picture books, moving colorful pieces, and exploring new objects. Sophie, by contrast, remained withdrawn, usually holding her stuffed bear close, watching her sister attentively, but showing little interest in the exercises. Jonathan noted these differences and recognized them as personality traits, never imagining they might mean something more than what the doctors had already decreed. To him, it was all part of the same inevitable fate. In that household, the absence of sound had become routine. The staff had grown accustomed to walking quietly, lowering their voices, not because the girls could hear, but because the atmosphere itself seemed to demand restraint. The garden outside, alive with birdsong in the early morning, went unnoticed by the twins, who never reacted to the daily symphony. Jonathan often stood at the windows, imagining what it would be like if Emily and Sophie ran outside, drawn by a particular bird's call. But in his mind, that was nothing more than an impossible dream. He accepted the doctor's instructions as final and, no matter how much it pained him, lacked the courage to define them. His life, once defined by quick, confident decisions in business, was now reduced to following protocols that yielded no results, but that he believed were the only way to care for his daughters properly. One winter night, exhausted after long hours of work and meetings, Jonathan stepped into the girls' bedroom. He found Emily curled beneath a colorful blanket and Sophie asleep, clutching her bear to her chest. Moving quietly, he ran his fingers through their hair and felt the weight of the silence pressing in around him. This was the moment he allowed himself to be fragile, hidden from the eyes of the staff and the medical advisors. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching the steady rhythm of his daughter's breathing for a long time. There was nothing more he could do but follow the recommended treatments, keep hiring professionals, and hold on to the belief that he was giving them the best life possible. Before leaving the room, he whispered a few words to himself, reaffirming his private vow never to give up. Jonathan didn't know if he would ever hear a different answer, but in his heart, he carried one certainty. He would never stop trying to give his daughters everything within his reach. That morning, the Harris mansion welcomed a new employee. Jonathan, always strict about who would have access to his daughters, had left the selection to the housekeeper with clear instructions to choose someone responsible, caring, and fully committed. That's how Grace Miller came into the picture. At 26, she already had experience working with children in several households. Officially hired to help with household duties, she carried with her a unique background. She had once worked as an assistant at a school for deaf children, and because of that, had learned sign language early on. For Grace, signing had become second nature, something she used almost instinctively. She arrived at the mansion with steady steps, a little overwhelmed by its grandeur, but her calm eyes showed a quiet confidence. She was used to formal environments and knew that, above all else, her role demanded respect and dedication. Her first encounter with Emily and Sophie happened in the main hall. The girls were sitting on the rug, surrounded by colorful blocks, busy building towers that collapsed as quickly as they were made. Grace walked toward them slowly, without haste, and knelt down so she could meet them at eye level. She didn't say anything. Instead, she made a simple hand gesture, agreeing in sign language paired with a gentle smile. Emily noticed right away. Her curiosity piqued, while Sophie kept focusing on the toy but stole a quick glance. Without forcing anything, Grace continued with a few basic signs, turning the exchange into a playful little game, tracing shapes in the air. The girls, shy but attentive, followed her movements with their eyes. In a household where staff usually kept a formal distance from the children, that moment felt different. Grace wasn't pushing for interaction. She was simply offering a form of communication that went beyond spoken words. Over the next few days, Grace did her work efficiently, yet she always found small moments to spend with the twins. Whenever she could, she came up with playful visual games, mixing signs with simple gestures, turning ordinary activities into moments of connection. It was during these little interactions that she started to notice details that caught her attention. One afternoon, while tidying up toys, she accidentally dropped a wooden lid. The sound was muffled by the carpet, but Grace noticed Emily turn her head quickly, as if she had picked up on something. Another time, Sophie, lying on her stuffed bear, seemed to smile right as a door creaked in the background. Small gestures, perhaps meaningless to others, but to Grace they didn't line up with the idea of complete deafness. She didn't allow herself to jump to conclusions. Grace knew that movements could be coincidences, that reactions could just as easily be reflexes. Even so, her experience made it hard to dismiss what she was seeing. Emily's attentive look when a chair scraped against the floor, Sophie's subtle change in expression at everyday noises. These weren't random. They repeated themselves often enough to raise questions. Grace carried with her the memory of other deaf children she had known, and in comparing those experiences to what she saw in Emily and Sophie, something felt different. However discreet, the girl's reactions seemed real, suggesting a hidden sensitivity that the doctor's reports had completely overlooked. She kept these thoughts to herself. After all, her position in the house didn't give her the authority to question medical expertise. Trusting her instincts, Grace decided to test things quietly, without drawing attention. One late afternoon, she brought a small toy drum from the playroom, one that had been left forgotten in a corner. Sitting on the floor across from the girls, she tapped its side firmly enough to make a clear sound. Emily looked straight at her with a faint smile. Grace tried again, this time lighter, and noticed Sophie, who had been distracted, lift her head. She moved around the room, striking the drum from different spots behind them, at their side, from farther away. The reactions weren't dramatic, but they were consistent. Grace's heartbeat raced with each new sign of awareness. They weren't complete responses, but there was something there, something that contradicted the idea of absolute silence. That evening, Grace returned to her duties and kept her observations to herself. She carried them like a secret, replaying the scenes in her mind while cleaning rooms and straightening objects. The expressions on the girls' faces stayed with her, refusing to fade, and she knew deep down she had witnessed something important. Yet she wrestled with a dilemma. Should she remain the obedient employee, confined to her tasks, or risk speaking up to a father who had always trusted only the most renowned specialists? For the time being, she chose silence. But with each unexpected smile from Emily and every glance Sophie gave toward a sudden noise, Grace's private conviction grew stronger. There was more to these girls than the medical files claimed, and she could no longer ignore it. In the days that followed, Grace carried a growing unease inside her. Between sweeping floors, polishing furniture, and keeping the mansion in order, her mind remained occupied with the twins' reactions. Each gesture, each glance, replayed in her memory like a puzzle that begged for answers. She knew her position in the household was delicate. She was just a newly hired employee, responsible for basic tasks, with no authority to question medical diagnoses. Still, her conscience wouldn't allow her to remain silent. Every time she crossed paths with Jonathan in the hallways, she saw a man who looked exhausted yet determined, someone who didn't deserve to be misled. She decided she needed to speak up, even at the risk of being misunderstood or even dismissed. The truth, or at least what she believed it to be, needed to be said. The opportunity came one afternoon while Jonathan was in his office, buried in reports and business calls. Grace asked permission to enter, and once he agreed, she approached with steady but respectful posture. Her voice was careful and measured as she explained that she wasn't a doctor, but that she had worked with deaf children before. She spoke of her experience in specialized schools, then shared what she had been noticing in Emily and Sophie. She described Emily turning her head at certain noises, Sophie smiling when a door creaked, and other subtle responses that didn't seem like mere coincidence. Jonathan lifted his eyes from the paperwork and stared at her in silence. His first reaction was resistance, as though he were facing yet another false hope. He wasn't willing to entertain Dodd. Sensing his hesitation, Grace emphasized that she wasn't trying to challenge medical authorities, only to share what she had seen. Her movements were restrained, but the conviction in her eyes spoke for itself. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, breathing deeply, and said nothing for several long seconds. The silence between them was broken only by the distant echo of footsteps. In the hallway, his mind wandered to the years of repeated diagnoses, to the countless reports that had never once mentioned any sign of auditory response. Part of him wanted to dismiss her words immediately, but another part recognized her sincerity. She had nothing to gain by inventing this. Still, his doubt was obvious. In a direct tone, he asked, "Are you telling me you think my daughters can hear?" Grace answered that she didn't know to what extent, but she was convinced there was something there, and that it was worth investigating. As they spoke, Emily and Sophie slowly came down the stairs. Just then, Grace's phone, left on the table, vibrated with a sharp notification sound. The girls paused for a moment and turned their faces toward it, as if searching for the source. Jonathan watched silently, unsettled. To him, it could have been coincidence, but Grace studied them intently. It wasn't a deliberate response, but it wasn't nothing either. It didn't fit with the idea of complete auditory absence. Jonathan walked over to them and called their names, but there was no reaction. Grace quietly explained that this wasn't about understanding spoken words, but about small reflexes, spontaneous reactions to sounds that needed to be tested more. Carefully, still torn between disbelief and hope, Jonathan began asking more precise questions. He wanted to know exactly what Grace had done, how the girls had reacted, and how often it happened. She recounted everything in detail. The toy, drum, the scraping chair, the wooden lid falling, and how the children consistently turned their eyes toward the source of the sounds. She didn't use technical terms, but her account was grounded in clear observations. Jonathan listened in silence, caught between skepticism and a deep desire to believe. He knew that if there was even the slightest chance Grace was right, he couldn't afford to ignore it. But he also feared letting hope in, only to be crushed by disappointment once more. It felt like a door he had kept locked for years was suddenly left ajar. At last, Jonathan exhaled heavily, moving toward the desk and placing his hands on the scattered papers. He admitted that he couldn't accept conclusions based solely on impressions, but that he also had no reason to dismiss her completely. Grace stood her ground and suggested they seek out another evaluation, this time with a different specialist, someone unconnected to the previous doctors. Jonathan fell silent, thoughtful, then finally gave a slight nod. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. The weight of responsibility was written in his expression. The fear of being misled again lingered, yet hidden in his eyes was the faintest spark of hope. Jonathan had reached the point where he could no longer rely solely on the old opinions. Grace's words, combined with the small reactions he himself had started to notice, unsettled him in ways he could not ignore. The memories of Collins, Wallace, and Monroe repeating the same conclusions now seemed less like scientific consensus and more like a rehearsed echo, something repeated without genuine depth. Part of him feared he was feeding false hope, but another part of him could no longer live with doubt. It was in this conflicted state that he authorized a new consultation, this time with someone completely outside the circle of previous doctors. Grace, careful yet confident, suggested Dr. Cheng, a physician respected for her ethics and her dedication to pediatric evaluations. Jonathan accepted the recommendation, not only trusting her reputation, but also driven by his growing need to break away from the cycle of identical answers he had been given for years. Dr. Cheng's arrival at the mansion carried a very different tone. She didn't show up with a large team, nor did she carry herself with the air of untouchable authority that the other specialists had displayed. Instead, she introduced herself calmly, taking time to observe the surroundings, ask questions about the girls' routines, and show genuine interest in meeting them before beginning any tests. Emily and Sophie, used to distant medical visits, displayed a flicker of curiosity at this gentle figure who approached without hurry. Jonathan, seated in an armchair, watched cautiously. He was prepared to hear yet another repetition of the phrase, saying diagnosis, but deep down, he was clinging to the hope that this time would be different. Grace stayed nearby, her attention sharp, watching every move. The first test Dr. Cheng conducted followed standard medical protocols. Using advanced equipment, she delivered auditory stimuli at different frequencies, measuring physiological responses. The initial results showed no significant changes, appearing to confirm what the earlier evaluations had claimed. Jonathan's heart sank as the graphs remained flat, as if he were reliving the weight of those first diagnoses. For a moment, he nearly convinced himself that Grace had been mistaken. But Dr. Cheng didn't stop there. Calmly, she turned off the equipment and explained that she wanted to try complementary methods approaches closer to the children's daily experiences. This caught Jonathan's attention immediately. He sensed in her a willingness to go beyond the surface, something he had never seen from the other specialists. At Dr. Cheng's request, Grace stepped in to help. The doctor believed that having someone familiar present could encourage more authentic responses. Grace brought over a few simple toys, a child's drum, a wooden box, and small handbells. With gentle movements, she began producing sounds at different spots around the room, closely observing the girls' reactions. Emily turned her head toward the drum when it was struck more firmly. Sophie lifted her eyes when the persistent jingling of the bells filled the air. None of the reactions were exaggerated, but they were consistent. Dr. Cheng quietly took notes, visibly surprised by what she was witnessing. When she finished, she remarked that these subtle responses were inconsistent with the notion of complete deafness. There was indeed some perception, limited but undeniably present, overlooked by earlier diagnoses. Curious and uneasy, Dr. Cheng asked to review the old medical reports. Jonathan handed over neatly organized folders he had kept since the girls were born. As she went through page after page, she noticed a troubling pattern. The tests were repetitive, methods rarely varied, and the conclusions were practically identical. There was no record of more sensitive or alternative approaches being attempted. In a few reports, she even found brief mentions of minimal responses dismissed as irrelevant. Her brow furrowed as she carefully pointed out that the evaluations seemed designed more to reinforce a diagnosis than to explore every possibility. Jonathan listened in silence, frustration weighing heavy as he realized how much had been overlooked. By the end of the day, the decision was clear. They needed a more detailed monitoring process, recording every small reaction the girl showed. Dr. Cheng proposed holding future sessions not only in a clinic, but also within the mansion itself, where the twins felt at ease. There, surrounded by familiar objects, everyday noises, and play, their reactions could be observed naturally. Jonathan agreed at once, willing to turn his home into a kind of observation center if it meant finally getting answers. Grace, for her part, felt a mixture of relief and responsibility. She knew it was a risky step, but for the first time, medical authority was willing to look at Emily and Sophie as more than just what the paperwork dictated. Jonathan accepted Dr. Cheng's proposal to turn part of the mansion into a space for continuous observation without hesitation. It wasn't a simple decision, after all.
He was used to seeing his home arranged as the backdrop for social gatherings
or business meetings, but at that moment, nothing mattered more than discovering the truth about his daughters. Dr. Cheng's trusted team brought in modern equipment capable of recording physiological reactions to sound stimuli. Sensors were discreetly installed in several rooms. Cameras were positioned so as not to disturb the children, and portable devices were placed around the main hall. Jonathan watched everything unfold with a strange feeling, as though the house, once defined by silence, was now preparing to reveal secrets it had hidden for years. He followed each detail closely, even without fully understanding the technical terms, because he wanted to see with his own eyes any sign that contradicted what he had always been told. The tests began on a bright morning, when Emily and Sophie were in good spirits. Grace was asked to participate actively, since her presence seemed to make the girls more relaxed and receptive. Sitting on the floor beside them, she introduced simple objects capable of producing sharp, strong sounds. A small children's drum with a rigid surface, wooden blocks that clapped together with dry snaps, and metallic bells whose ringing echoed clearly through the room. With each stimulus, the team recorded not only visual responses, but also physiological ones, captured by the sensors. Emily quickly turned her body when the drum was struck firmly. Sophie, who had been lying down clutching her stuffed bear, lifted her eyes when the loud crash of wooden blocks hit the floor. These responses, documented in video and in graphs, were subtle but consistent enough to draw the attention of everyone present. Jonathan watched the scenes with his heart tightening. For years, he had grown accustomed to technical reports describing total absence of response, and now he was witnessing with his own eyes his daughters reacting, however faintly, to sounds around them. They weren't bursting into smiles or making dramatic gestures, but these spontaneous movements were undeniable. Every glance toward the drum, every shift in expression caused by the ringing bell, fueled his hope a little more. Even so, he tried to keep his emotions in check. He didn't want to get carried away and risk being crushed by disappointment again. Grace, on the other hand, didn't hide her satisfaction at seeing her observations confirmed. The spark in her eyes revealed that her persistence in noticing details had not been in vain. With every session, the team compiled meticulous notes. It wasn't only about watching gestures or expressions, but about cross-referencing data, fluctuations in heart rate, changes in breathing patterns, and subtle shifts in posture. All of these indicators were compiled into graphs that clearly showed consistent responses to specific stimuli. Dr. Cheng whispered comments to her assistants as she organized the reports in chronological order to make comparative analysis easier. For the first time, Jonathan saw numbers and images that pointed toward a reality entirely different from what past diagnoses had imposed. He stayed focused, absorbing every detail, with the sense that these pages had the power to rewrite his daughter's story. The individual differences between Emily and Sophie also became more evident in the records. While one responded more quickly, the other displayed subtler but steady reactions. Dr. Cheng explained that this didn't mean unequal abilities, but rather distinct profiles of perception that needed to be tracked separately. Grace played a key role, adapting activities to each child's behavior and keeping them engaged without effort. For Jonathan, this was eye-opening. It wasn't enough to place his daughters under a single, closed diagnosis. They were two unique children with their own paths to follow. That realization changed how he looked at them, not as limited, but as full of different possibilities waiting to be explored. When the equipment was turned off and the team left, Jonathan remained alone in the hall, surrounded by silence once again.
He looked at the papers scattered across the table, replaying in his mind everything he had witnessed that day. He didn't need anyone to explain what it all meant. The memory of how his daughters had responded was enough to prove that Something had been wrong with the earlier diagnoses. Slowly, he walked over to the window, rested his hands on the sill, and let out a deep sigh. He still didn't know what consequences might come from challenging the medical system he had trusted for so long. But he was certain of one thing. He could no longer pretend nothing had changed. For the first time in years, he carried not only hope but concrete proof that he had to keep moving forward. The decision to seek new evaluations quickly stirred reactions among the circle of specialists who had followed Emily and Sophie from the beginning. The first to speak out was Dr. Collins in a brief and cold phone call. On the other end of the line, his voice carried both authority and disdain. He asked Jonathan if he really believed that a household employee could challenge years of medical experience. He warned that insisting on parallel investigations would only bring frustration and emotional strain to the girls. Jonathan listened, in silence, gripping the phone tightly. He didn't answer right away, but when he hung up, he felt the weight of the unspoken pressure bearing down on him. It was as if he were challenging not just diagnoses, but reputations built and protected within prestigious circles. A few days later, he received a formal letter signed by Dr. Wallace. The tone of the document seemed polite, but it was laced with insinuations. In it, the doctor reaffirmed his previous diagnosis and wrote that any attempt at further review would only serve to confuse the children, potentially causing psychological harm. He argued that desperate parents searching for hope were easy prey for well-meaning but unqualified individuals. Jonathan read every line carefully, his emotions shifting between indignation and helplessness. He recognized it for what it was, an attempt at damage control, an effort to discredit any suggestion that a mistake had been made. He tucked the letter away in a drawer, fully aware that more resistance was bound to come. Dr. Monroe, on the other hand, chose to speak indirectly through an article published in a national medical journal. Without naming anyone, she described wealthy families who, in her words, were misled by amateur observations and wasted resources on experiments without scientific basis. The message was unmistakable, and Jonathan felt personally targeted. The article circulated among professionals in the field and eventually reached his business contacts, sparking quiet remarks at dinners and meetings. With each passing day, he felt more exposed. Jonathan realized he was no longer up against 3 individual doctors, but against an entire network of influence capable of using media and public opinion to safeguard their own reputations. Faced with this scenario, Jonathan swung between moments of doubt and determination. At times, the pressure felt overwhelming, as if the weight of medical authority was insurmountable. There were nights when he relived the frustration of all those years and nearly convinced himself that giving up was the safer choice, to accept what he had been told all along. But then he would remember the recent reports, the charts with concrete reactions, and he found the strength to believe he was not mistaken. Grace played a vital role in keeping him balanced. Whenever Jonathan showed signs of doubt, she reminded him of the small victories: Emily turning her head toward a sound, Sophie's faint smile in response to a loud noise. These memories grounded him, countering the barrage of criticism coming from the outside. Dr. Cheng, fully aware of the pressure Jonathan was under, remained steadfast in her ethical stance. She advised him not to yield to veiled threats and assured him that the data they had collected spoke for itself. Science, she explained, is not built on convenience but on evidence, and the records already gathered were more than enough to justify further investigation. For her, there was no going back. Ignoring the girls' responses would be as irresponsible as the rushed diagnoses of the past. Her words provided Jonathan with reassurance, reminding him he wasn't alone in this fight. She also made a point to recognize Grace's contribution, acknowledging the importance of her initial observations. The alliance between the 2 women became a solid foundation,
against the resistance that was growing on the other side. That evening, Jonathan met with Grace and Dr. Cheng in the mansion's main hall. He spread the new reports across the table, carefully arranged, and made it clear that he would not back down. The three of them spoke at length, evaluating strategies, discussing the next steps, and reflecting on the risks they still faced. Jonathan knew he was challenging a system that refused to admit its own failures, but hesitation was no longer an option. Emily and Sophie played in the background, oblivious to the seriousness of the moment, and that simple image reminded Jonathan why he was fighting. It wasn't about medical reputations or social appearances anymore. He was fighting for his daughter's right to be seen for who they truly were, not reduced to numbers in repetitive reports. The growing pressure from the renowned doctors did not stop Jonathan from seeking support elsewhere. Following Dr. Cheng's advice, he reached out to Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a specialist in medical ethics and professional investigation, known for her uncompromising stance in cases of misconduct. She had built a reputation for scrutinizing documents with rigor and questioning questionable practices within the scientific community. Upon receiving the material on Emily and Sophie, she devoted herself to reviewing every page, comparing the old diagnoses with the recent reports produced in the mansion. Her careful reading revealed a clear pattern: negligence in the methods applied and, possibly, interests that went beyond science. Jonathan followed the process closely, and with every explanation she offered, his indignation grew. It wasn't just his daughter's lives at stake. It was also the trust he had once placed in professionals who now seemed to have acted carelessly. Based on her analysis, Dr. Carter recommended that the case be taken further, not only administratively, but also publicly. Jonathan hesitated at first. Going public meant exposing his life and that of his daughters to society and the press, something he had always avoided. Yet he understood that staying silent would only serve those who wanted to bury the truth. After days of reflection, he decided to file a formal complaint with the medical board and, in parallel, give interviews to specialized outlets. It wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that other families wouldn't go through the same ordeal. Grace supported him quietly, caring for the girls and giving him the strength of her presence. For her, watching Jonathan take this step was proof that he was finally ready to face any obstacle to protect Emily and Sophie. The reaction was immediate. Jonathan's first interviews appeared in major newspapers, accompanied by technical reports provided by Dr. Cheng and Dr. Carter. The story drew attention not only because it involved a billionaire, but also because it questioned medical practices, long considered infallible. Television programs invited specialists to debate the issue, and soon divergent opinions emerged. Some defended the accused doctors, claiming that complex diagnoses could always lead to interpretive errors. Others, however, pointed out that the repetition of identical reports without deeper exploration was clear negligence. Society was divided, and Jonathan's voice began to resonate as that of a father, unwilling to accept shallow answers any longer. To make the allegations even clearer, Jonathan organized a press conference in his own mansion. Sitting before cameras and journalists, he recounted in detail the journey from the first diagnosis to the recent tests that had revealed consistent reactions. At his side were Dr. Cheng and Dr. Carter, who confirmed each point with technical explanations. Jonathan did not hold back when mentioning Grace, describing her as the first person to notice what no one else had seen. Embarrassed by the attention, Grace chose to remain silent, but his words made clear that her role was recognized and valued. Meanwhile, Emily and Sophie played in the garden, oblivious to the moment, while photographers captured images of them smiling under the sun. The medical community's response was intense. Many respected professionals, upon learning the details, began questioning the conduct of Collins, Wallace, and Monroe, The lack of independent reviews, the rush to confirm diagnoses, and the refusal to consider alternative observations were increasingly seen as serious failings. Foreign newspapers picked up the story, adding even more pressure. At the same time, some criticized Jonathan for exposing his daughters publicly, suggesting he was turning their situation into a spectacle. But those voices were soon drowned out by the impact of the evidence. The debate grew, and with it the realization that this was not an isolated case, but a symptom of structural problems in how pediatric diagnoses were handled. While the press argued, life inside the mansion moved to a different rhythm. Emily and Sophie played in the garden, swinging from ropes tied to an old tree. Grace watched them carefully, noticing how they reacted to the sharp calls of nearby birds. Jonathan, seeing them laugh and move with such joy, felt something he hadn't in years. The sense that hope was no longer just a distant idea, but a tangible part of his daily life. There were no guarantees about the future, but for the first time in a long while, he no longer felt alone in the fight. He had professionals by his side. He had the courage to expose the truth, and above all, he had proof that his daughters had been misunderstood. The battle was only beginning, but absolute. Silence no longer reigned in his home. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to the mansion, filled with appointments, tests, and reports. Dr. Cheng's team, now joined by speech and hearing specialists, analyzed every detail of the girl's reactions to strong auditory stimuli. The accumulated data pointed to something the earlier diagnoses had ignored. Emily and Sophie had significant residual hearing, enough to consider cochlear implants. Jonathan listened carefully as the technical explanation was laid out. A cochlear implant is an electronic device surgically placed in the cochlea, bypassing the damaged parts of the ear and sending signals directly to the auditory nerve. It would not provide natural hearing nor immediate results, but it offered a tangible chance at progress. For the first time, a specialist told Jonathan that his daughters might not only perceive sounds, but also learn to interpret them. The decision was not made hastily. Jonathan spent long nights weighing the risks, listening to testimonies from other families, and gathering information from specialized centers. Dr. Cheng was clear. The implant would not restore full hearing, but would open doors to greater independence, provided there was discipline in the follow-up therapies. The process would demand patience, consistent auditory training, and psychological adjustment, since children who have lived in silence often find their first sounds overwhelming, even unpleasant. Jonathan considered every detail, fearing to create false expectations, but he realized that denying the opportunity would be more painful than facing the challenges. After much reflection, he gave his consent for both daughters. Grace stood by him, reminding him that the goal was not speed, but the path that would open from that moment forward. The day of the surgery arrived under a heavy cloud of tension. Jonathan accompanied Emily and Sophie into the prep room, holding their small hands tightly, offering reassurance they didn't fully understand. Grace stayed close, radiating calm and affection. The procedure was long, but it unfolded as expected. In the days that followed, as the girls recovered, they entered the waiting period before the external devices could be activated. Jonathan imagined the activation day would be emotional, but he also knew, thanks to the guidance he'd received, not to expect miracles. Hope mingled with anxiety, and the atmosphere in the mansion grew heavy with anticipation. When the day of activation finally arrived, the scene was unforgettable. Emily's eyes widened at a sudden high-pitched sound, but she instinctively covered her ears, startled. Sophie frowned at noises that seemed metallic and strange, almost unrecognizable. Their reactions weren't of wonder, but of discomfort. The technicians explained this was normal. Their brains were receiving stimuli they had never experienced before and would need time to learn how to process them. Jonathan watched in silence, torn between the thrill of seeing unprecedented responses and the weight of knowing the road ahead would be long. Grace crouched beside the girls, repeating signs and playful gestures to reassure them, showing them that the unfamiliar didn't have to be frightening. Adaptation was slow and required careful management. Loud sounds were avoided, as they could be painful and overwhelming. Instead, the routine was filled with gradual exposure, light tapping on surfaces, clapping close by, calling their names from different directions. Session by session, the girls showed small but steady progress. Emily began recognizing her own name when called still without responding verbally, but turning her head toward the sound. Sophie, in her own time, began smiling at simple melodies, even if she couldn't reproduce them yet. Auditory therapy became part of daily life, and the mansion, once ruled by absolute silence, now echoed with structured sounds introduced with patience and care. As the weeks passed, their progress became undeniable. The twins started distinguishing lower voices from higher ones and began to babble their own sounds, encouraged by Grace and the therapists. Jonathan, deeply moved, joined some sessions himself, trying to find new ways to connect with his daughters. Seeing Emily smile as she recognized fragments of her father's voice, or watching Sophie light up at a simple tune, was more than he had dared to hope for years earlier. There was no promise of perfect hearing, but there was progress there. It was a future. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt that the fight was no longer against absolute silence, but for the patient construction of a sound-filled world opening up before them. The discoveries surrounding Emily and Sophie quickly spread beyond the mansion and reached the halls of medical institutions. Prompted by Jonathan's formal complaint and reinforced by the consistent reports from Dr. Cheng and Dr. Carter, the medical board launched an official investigation into the previous diagnoses. The press, still following the story closely, reported on every step. Meetings were convened, specialists were called to testify, and the medical community was forced to confront something it had long ignored: the need to revisit rigid protocols that sealed cases with definitive labels. Jonathan received regular updates through his lawyers and from Dr. Carter herself, but he didn't allow himself to get carried away by institutional proceedings. What mattered most to him was watching his daughters make progress in therapy, however gradual. Still, he couldn't ignore the wider impact his struggle was beginning to have. Inside the mansion, life was also changing. Emily and Sophie now attended regular auditory rehabilitation sessions at specialized clinics, always accompanied by Grace, whose role in the process had become nearly indispensable. The therapies included games, simple songs, repetition exercises, and interaction with professionals who reinforced stimulation. At first, frustration was common. Loud sounds still bothered them, and sudden noises led to visible irritation. But over time, adaptation gave way to clear victories. Emily now consistently turned when her father called her name in a firm tone. Sophie, more reserved, began recognizing rhythms and clapping along offbeat, but enthusiastic. Each achievement was celebrated as a triumph, not only by Jonathan but by everyone involved. Meanwhile, in internal meetings, the Ethics Board and the National Medical Council debated sweeping changes to pediatric diagnostic protocols. The proposal gaining traction required that no report of total deafness could be considered final without evaluation by at least 2 independent professionals with no ties to each other. In addition, periodic reassessments at set intervals would become mandatory, ensuring children's development was tracked over time. These measures, directly inspired by the Harris case, represented a structural shift that many considered overdue. The story of the twins, once seen as an exception, was now becoming a reference. Media outlets described Jonathan not just as a businessman, but as a father who refused to accept a flawed system. Jonathan, invited to seminars and conferences, began speaking publicly about his experience. He wasn't a charismatic speaker, but his steady demeanor and restrained emotion resonated with audiences. He spoke about the importance of second opinions, about not treating medical reports as unchangeable sentences, and above all, about the responsibility of institutions to provide real solutions for families. He always emphasized Grace's role, describing her as the attentive eye that first brought new light to the case. She remained discreet, but followed his steps with quiet pride, aware of the transformation she had helped spark. Emily and Sophie, still adapting, appeared in short videos at these events, reacting to sounds and smiling, living symbols that the effort was worth it. The changes also reached the school environment. For the first time, Jonathan considered enrolling his daughters in a mainstream institution, supported by audiology specialists and teachers trained to assist them. The chosen school offered small classes and adapted resources, ensuring that Emily and Sophie could interact with other children in a stimulating setting. Their presence drew attention at first, but soon it was accepted naturally. The twins, still in the adaptation process, showed genuine interest in playing and learning alongside classmates. Grace accompanied them daily, reinforcing signs when needed and helping translate new sounds into meaningful experiences. For Jonathan, watching them walk through school hallways, their discreet external devices visible yet no longer defining them, was proof that life was truly changing. One evening, after a long day filled with therapies and meetings, Jonathan sat with Grace on the mansion's veranda. They talked about the girl's future, about the challenges still ahead, and about how the house, once defined by silence, was now alive with new discoveries. He admitted his fear that the progress might not be enough, but Grace reminded him that every step, no matter how small, was already a monumental victory. Jonathan fell quiet, watching Emily and Sophie play in the garden. Words failed him. For the first time in years, he no longer saw only a path of pain and frustration. He saw possibilities. And that vision, however uncertain, gave him the strength to keep moving forward. Several years had passed since Emily and Sophie's surgery and the beginning of their rehabilitation. Time, which once felt like an enemy, had become an ally in their adaptation. Auditory therapy sessions had gradually been replaced with regular classes at school, where the girls now participated in activities on equal footing with their peers. The journey hadn't been easy. There were moments of frustration, tears, and rejection of sounds that seemed too harsh or overwhelming. But with patience and consistent guidance, everything began to change. Jonathan, who once split himself between business and constant worry, reorganized his life to be present for every step forward. The mansion, once cloaked in silence and anguish, was now filled with conversations, children's songs, and laughter echoing down the halls. Jonathan also solidified the foundation he had envisioned after the scandal. The Institute provided support to families with children diagnosed with hearing loss, offering free second opinion consultations, therapeutic follow-ups, and access to subsidized hearing equipment. The initiative grew quickly, gaining support from companies and professionals moved by the twins' story. At every new center opening, Jonathan made sure to be there with Emily and Sophie, proving it wasn't just philanthropy but a personal mission. Now teenagers, the girls actively participated in these events, sharing their experiences with other children and inspiring them with courage. Grace, who continued to work alongside the family, took on the role of coordinating the foundation's educational activities, turning her devotion into a lifelong mission. At home, the changes were just as significant. Emily showed an unexpected gift for music, surprising her teachers with her interest in the piano, an instrument she had never imagined playing. Even with certain limitations, she practiced diligently, mastering simple melodies, an effort that filled everyone with pride. Sophie, on the other hand, had a natural talent for communication, using both speech and signs, always ready to help classmates facing similar challenges. Each in her own way, the twins had become living symbols of resilience and adaptation. Jonathan followed their progress with teary eyes, remembering the time he believed they would never respond to any sound. Now, he saw not only his beloved daughters, but young women full of promise and possibilities. The foundation also began promoting public debates on medical ethics, demanding greater responsibility from healthcare professionals. The Harris case had become an international reference, cited at conferences and in academic studies. New protocols were adopted in several countries, requiring broader and multidisciplinary evaluations before definitive diagnoses could be made. Jonathan, who had never sought the spotlight, found himself at the center of a movement that benefited thousands of families. Grace, always at his side, reminded him that the true achievement was simply never giving up, even when all seemed lost. Emily and Sophie, appearing at these events, became undeniable proof that science, persistence, and love could move forward hand in hand. Life at the mansion had completely transformed. Meals were now filled with conversations, still with occasional pauses or mispronunciations, but rich with meaning. Jonathan was deeply moved each time he heard his daughters call him Dad in clear voices, something he had once thought impossible. Grace shared in those moments with the same emotion, remembering when she had first arrived at the house as just a maid. The bond between her and the girls went far beyond any professional role. She had become part of the family, an irreplaceable presence in their journey. The silence that had once ruled over the household had given way to a home alive with sounds, words, and shared stories. The height of this transformation came on a special evening when the foundation hosted a benefit concert in a packed theater. Emily and Sophie, side by side, walked onto the stage before hundreds of people. With the guidance of a music teacher, they played a simple melody on the piano together, drawing warm, thunderous applause from the audience. Jonathan, overcome with emotion, watched from the front row with Grace at his side. It wasn't about technical perfection, but about achieving something that once seemed impossible. Seeing his daughters before the crowd, sending out hope through notes that resonated across the hall, he felt the legacy was complete. It wasn't just about overcoming deafness. It was about transforming pain into strength, silence into sound, and despair into new life. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.